Tiananmen Square. Located in the heart of Beijing, it is the largest public square in the world, capable of holding over 1 million people. For centuries, this plaza has served as the stage for China's triumphs and tragedies. It was here that Mao Zedong proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. Yet, beneath the surface of national pride, Tiananmen Square holds another story, a darker chapter etched into its very stones. A story of hope and idealism brutally crushed, of peaceful protest met with unimaginable violence. A story that the Chinese government has desperately tried to erase, but one that continues to resonate worldwide. To grasp the magnitude of what transpired in Tiananmen Square in June 1989, we must turn back to the decade that preceded it. The 1980s in China was a time of profound transformation, marked by both exhilarating progress and simmering discontent. Deng Xiaoping, emerging as the paramount leader, embarked on an ambitious program of economic reforms. These reforms aimed to modernize China's economy by introducing elements of market capitalism while maintaining the Communist Party's firm grip on power. China's economy boomed, lifting millions out of poverty and propelling the nation onto the global stage. However, this period of rapid economic growth was not without its downsides. Inflation soared, income inequality widened, and corruption flourished. A seed of dissent was sown, particularly among the nation's students and intellectuals who yearned for greater freedom and a voice in their country's future. Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms created a society riddled with contradictions. The influx of wealth benefited many but also exacerbated social inequalities. A new class of wealthy entrepreneurs emerged, while millions of rural farmers and urban workers struggled with the rising cost of living. This disparity fueled resentment and disillusionment, particularly among the younger generation. They witnessed the gap between the rhetoric of socialism and the reality of China's new economic order. Adding to this unease was the government's tight control over information and expression. While economic liberalization was encouraged, political reform remained taboo. This climate of repression further alienated the younger generation who yearned for a more open and democratic society. The 1980s saw the rise of a new generation of Chinese students and intellectuals who were more outspoken and politically aware. They had grown up in the shadow of the Cultural Revolution, a decade of social and political upheaval. Inspired by the ideals of democracy and human rights, they formed student groups, organized debates, and published underground journals. They devoured the works of Western philosophers and political theorists, drawing parallels between global struggles for freedom and their own aspirations for a more democratic China. University campuses became hotbeds of intellectual ferment and political activism. Students began to voice their concerns about corruption, inequality, and the lack of political reform. The Chinese government, initially tolerant of limited expressions of dissent, grew wary of the growing student movement. The party leadership was divided on how to respond. Some advocated for dialogue and limited concessions to appease the students. Others favored a hardline stance, arguing that any sign of weakness would encourage further dissent. This internal debate played out against a backdrop of growing social unrest. Workers began to organize strikes and protests, and intellectuals became more vocal in their criticisms of the government. A palpable sense of anticipation hung in the air, a feeling that change was inevitable. The stage was set for a confrontation with profound consequences. The spark that ignited the tinderbox of discontent came in April 1989 with the unexpected death of Hu Yaobang. Hu, a former General Secretary of the Communist Party, was respected for his liberal views and commitment to reform. His death triggered an outpouring of grief and mourning across the country. Tens of thousands of students gathered in Tiananmen Square to pay their respects. What began as mourning quickly evolved into something more significant. Students began to voice their grievances against the government, calling for an end to corruption and greater freedom of speech. As the days turned into weeks, the crowds in Tiananmen Square continued to swell. The atmosphere remained largely peaceful, with students engaging in debates and creating banners expressing their demands for change. The student-led protests in Tiananmen Square resonated far beyond the university campuses. Ordinary citizens, inspired by the students' courage, began to join the demonstrations. Workers saw an opportunity to voice their own economic grievances. Intellectuals, writers, artists, and journalists added their voices to the chorus of dissent. The movement transformed into a broader expression of dissatisfaction with the lack of political freedom in China. The Chinese government struggled to formulate a cohesive response. Hardliners viewed the demonstrations as a direct threat to their authority and advocated for a swift crackdown. Reform-minded officials recognized the legitimacy of many grievances and feared that a violent crackdown would exacerbate the situation. As the protests in Tiananmen Square stretched into weeks, the world watched with fascination and trepidation. The images of hundreds of thousands of people peacefully assembled in Beijing captivated the global imagination. Western media outlets descended upon Beijing, capturing the drama unfolding in the square. The protests became a global media sensation, with daily updates and live broadcasts. Governments and organizations around the world expressed support for the protesters' right to peaceful assembly. The protests became a focal point for discussions about human rights and democracy. For many, the protests represented a glimmer of hope that the desire for freedom could not be extinguished. However, an undercurrent of anxiety persisted as the possibility of a violent crackdown loomed large. Within the Chinese Communist Party, a deep fissure was growing, splitting the leadership into two camps. Hardliners viewed the protests as an intolerable affront to their authority. They saw only anarchy and rebellion in the students' calls for democracy. Led by Premier Li Peng, they believed that force was the only language the protesters would understand. They advocated for a swift and decisive crackdown to crush the protests. On the other side stood a smaller, more reform-minded faction within the party. Figures like Zhao Ziang believed that dialogue and compromise offered the best hope for a peaceful resolution. They argued that a violent crackdown would only exacerbate the situation and alienate the population. As the protests in Tiananmen Square stretched into May, tensions escalated. The students remained steadfast in their demands for dialogue and reform. The hardliners within the party viewed the students' defiance as an intolerable provocation. On May 20th, 1989, the hardliners made their move. Premier Li Peng announced that the government had declared martial law in Beijing. He accused the protesters of engaging in counter-revolutionary activities and warned that the military would be deployed to restore order. The declaration of martial law marked a significant escalation of the crisis. The stage was set for a confrontation with far-reaching consequences for China and the world. Section 3. A city defiant, the people resist. The declaration of martial law did not have the intended effect. It galvanized their resolve, igniting a wave of defiance. Citizens formed human barricades against advancing troops. Workers, students, and retirees poured into the streets. They pleaded with troops to disobey orders. The world watched in awe. Unarmed civilians faced down tanks. Young men and women engaged soldiers in debates. The power of the people seemed unstoppable. Soldiers were caught off guard by the resistance. Many were young conscripts from rural areas. They faced peaceful protesters, not violence. The moral authority of the protesters gave soldiers pause. Darkness descends on Tiananmen. The fragile hope in Beijing was extinguished in the early hours of June 4, 1989. As darkness fell, tension settled over the crowd. Rumors of an imminent crackdown swirled. Exhausted but resolute, students huddled in makeshift camps, chanting slogans and singing songs. Some spoke of staying put, forming a human shield, while others considered retreat. The world held its breath, watching and waiting as news anchors relayed reports. In the final hours, a strange stillness descended, anticipation and fear crackling in the air. The crackdown begins. Shortly after 10 p.m., the eerie silence was shattered by the roar of engines and tank treads. The People's Liberation Army began its advance to clear the square. Columns of tanks and armored personnel carriers rumbled into the city. Soldiers fired on the crowd, sending terrified residents fleeing. Eyewitness accounts paint a harrowing picture of chaos and brutality. Tanks rolled over barricades, crushing anyone in their path. The violence spread like wildfire, engulfing the city in terror. Within Tiananmen Square itself, the students, many of whom had initially refused to believe that the army would actually fire on its own people, were now faced with the horrifying reality of the situation. Panic swept through the crowd as the sound of gunfire and the rumble of approaching tanks drew closer. Student leaders, their voices amplified by makeshift loudspeakers, urged the crowd to remain calm, to link arms, to stand their ground peacefully. But their pleas were drowned out by the deafening roar of the approaching military convoy, the ground trembling beneath their feet. The troops, under orders to clear the square by dawn, showed no mercy. They fired live ammunition into the fleeing crowds, their bullets cutting down students, workers, doctors, and journalists alike. Tanks, their heavy treads crushing tents and bodies indiscriminately, plowed through the square, leaving a trail of carnage in their wake. Eyewitnesses described scenes of unimaginable horror. Students, their bodies riddled with bullets collapsing onto piles of discarded banners and placards. Mothers, their cries of anguish echoing through the night, desperately searching for their missing children. Young men, their faces contorted in pain, carrying the lifeless bodies of their friends and loved ones out of the square. The white cloth of makeshift stretchers stained crimson with blood. As dawn broke over Beijing on June 4, 1989, a heavy silence descended on the city. The once bustling streets, now deserted and eerily quiet, were littered with the debris of the previous night's violence. Tiananmen Square, once a symbol of hope, was now a desolate wasteland. The Chinese government moved swiftly to erase all traces of the massacre. Foreign journalists were expelled and a strict media blackout was imposed. Eyewitness accounts, smuggled out at great risk, painted a very different picture. In the aftermath of the massacre, the Chinese government embarked on a campaign to erase June 4th from public memory. Silence descended upon the nation, as if speaking about the massacre could conjure back the ghosts of that night. The official narrative portrayed the protests as a counter-revolutionary rebellion. Students were branded as enemies of the state, their ideals twisted. The government controlled the narrative and silenced dissenting voices. Newspapers and TV stations were forbidden from mentioning the massacre. History textbooks were rewritten, erasing June 4th from the record. Those who challenged the narrative were swiftly silenced. Dissidents were arrested, imprisoned, or disappeared. Families of victims faced surveillance and harassment. The government seemed determined to make the world forget Tiananmen Square. By erasing the memory, they aimed to ensure their rule. But the truth, like a stubborn weed, resurfaces, reaching for the light. Section 2, A Wall of Silence, Censorship and its Legacy. The legacy of censorship in the aftermath of Tiananmen Square extends far beyond the immediate silencing of dissent. It has seeped into the very fabric of Chinese society, creating a culture of self-censorship. The fear of retribution hangs heavy in the air, a silent deterrent to open dialogue. The internet has become another battleground in the government's war on information. Sophisticated censorship mechanisms block access to foreign websites and sensitive content. Search engines filter out unfavorable results, creating an echo chamber of state-sanctioned narratives. This pervasive censorship has profoundly impacted Chinese society, especially the younger generation. Many young people today have little knowledge of the massacre, a blank space in their collective memory. The government's efforts to control the narrative have created a climate of fear and distrust. Critical thinking is stifled, and the free exchange of ideas is curtailed. The wall of silence continues to cast a long shadow over China, a stark reminder of the fragility of freedom. The world remembers Tiananmen. The events of June 4, 1989 sent shockwaves of outrage and condemnation across the globe. The images of unarmed civilians gunned down by their own government shattered the illusion of a China on the path to reform. Governments, organizations, and individuals voiced their condemnation of the massacre. Sanctions were imposed, and China found itself increasingly isolated on the world stage. In Hong Kong, the massacre sparked a wave of protests and a surge in pro-democracy sentiment. Millions took to the streets, their voices echoing the calls for freedom and democracy. The memory of Tiananmen became a rallying cry for Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement. For the international community, the Tiananmen Square massacre served as a stark reminder of the fragility of human rights. People. A legacy of hope and resilience. The events of June 4, 1989 remain etched in history as a stark reminder of the human cost of unchecked power. Tiananmen Square stands as a silent testament to the enduring struggle for human rights and democracy. The Chinese government has tried to erase the memory of that day, but the truth refuses to be extinguished. The legacy of Tiananmen Square is one of extraordinary courage, resilience, and unwavering hope. The image of the tank man has become an enduring symbol of peaceful resistance. The struggle for freedom and democracy in China continues to this day. They utilize technology to circumvent censorship and organize peaceful protests. Their courage in the face of constant surveillance is a testament to the enduring human spirit. The pursuit of freedom and democracy is a continuous journey, a relay race across generations. For as long as the memory of Tiananmen Square endures, so too will the